this is Garrick Zoeter, clarinet professor at the Shenandoah Conservatory. Today coming to you from Goodson Recital Hall here at Shenandoah. I'm here once again to give you some tips on how to prepare this time the 2023 Virginia All-State B-Flat Clarinet Prepared Etude. This year we are in rotation F, and this year we have a lot of controversy about this etude. So I'm going to address that right now before I play the piece for you, because there's a couple changes that have been made in the piece since I did my spiel about it about an hour ago. So what is it? Today's February 5th, 2023, and yeah, about an hour ago I recorded the masterclass part of this video. And so there have been some changes in the piece, believe it or not, in the last hour since then. So I speak in the video at the beginning about the fact that there is a low E flat written in the etude. And apparently it looks like in the last hour that's been changed. So you can ignore the part at the beginning of the video about the low E flat. It looks like most of you should have a copy that no longer has the low E flat written in it. Now, there may be an additional controversy. I don't know. I've been getting some messages from clarinet teachers in Virginia this afternoon about the fact that if we look at the piece, in measure 15, there is a molto ritardando written. And what is missing, I believe, in the music is an A tempo on beat 4 of measure 15. So, in the performance that I just did, that you're now going to hear in a second, I did an A tempo on the 4th beat of 15 and continued in that tempo to the end of the piece. It is possible at this point that that might have changed, and that in fact, the molto ritardando has been extended to the end of the piece. I don't know that for sure as of 3:30 on February 5th. So please consult your private teacher. Please consult your band director, if you do not have a private teacher, to find out whether or not there is an A tempo at the end of measure 15 on beat 4, or rather there is a ritardando that extends through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 measures. Yeah? I'm hoping that if you play it either way, your listeners, your jury, your adjudicators will not deduct any points. However, please consult your teachers to make sure you are playing beat 4 of measure 15 to the end of the piece in the correct way. Okay, so now I'm going to play you the piece, and then we'll go back to my studio down the hill here, and I will give you a little talk, which hopefully will make you play this piece a little bit better. This is a tough one, I hope you will listen to what I have to say and my performance, and that they will be helpful for you. Okay, here we go. All right, so let's talk about this piece. So to get something out of the way about this piece right at the beginning of my talk here, I want to talk a little bit about the low E flat that we see in measure 11. I have a feeling that this is causing some anxiety among students and probably amongst teachers too. Obviously, on the B-flat clarinet that we use in the United States, we do not have a low E flat. So you cannot play that low E flat in measure 11. How do we know that it's an E flat and not an E natural? Well, if we look in the next measure, in measure 12, we see an F flat, which is an E natural. And that tells us that that preceding note is actually a low E flat. So how do we solve this problem? Pretty easy. You heard me do it in the performance of the Etude. You simply take the low E flat up an octave, okay? And I can guarantee you that the jury that's listening to you is not going to take off points because you didn't play a low E flat, right? It simply doesn't exist. So that's how we deal with that. I thought I would get that out of the way right at the beginning of the video because I have a feeling this is probably the main area of worry that all of you are experiencing as you look at this piece, okay? So that's how we deal with that. So further looking at the rest of the piece, I thought this year we'd take a look at maybe 3 main areas to talk about. And of course I will probably go on a little bit more than that in other areas, as I often do on these videos. And hopefully you find that helpful. I don't know. So the first area we're going to talk about is my favorite topic in music, and that is the character of the piece, right? So we have no indication written anywhere in the Etude as to what the character of this music is. And that's largely up to you to decide, right? I'm going to tell you what I hear the character as, but of course it's up to you to decide what that is for yourself. So we have a tempo marking of quarter note equals 88 to 96. We have an awful lot of articulated notes in this piece, which to me gives it a very, I would say, sprightly, sort of spirited, energetic character. So I hear this as very sort of light, energetic, and sprightly, I think is the word that really comes to mind about this music. So, and we have, as I said there, we have tempo 88 to 96, which is a wide range of tempos to choose from. On the video, I chose quarter note equals 93, which is kind of right in the middle, but it's up to you to choose between 88 and 96. And a tempo at 88 will produce a slightly different character than a tempo at 96 will. But it's very, very, very important for all of you to think about what is the character of the music I'm trying to play here, okay? So I leave it to you to decide. If you agree with me, that's great. If you don't agree with me, no problem. As long as you have an idea in your head of what you want the character to be, that's all we need. Okay, so how do we create character on the clarinet, right? How do we do that? How do we create different characters? Well, one of the main ways we do this on the instrument is through articulation. And that brings us to the second area that I want to focus on in this piece, which is articulation. In learning this Etude this morning, I realized that this is largely an articulation study, right? We have a lot of tongue notes. We have quite a bit of slur to, tongue to, or tongue to, slur to, depending on how you want to think of it in the music. And we have that throughout the entire piece, basically. But that's not the only place that we have slur to, tongue to. We also have other articulations in the piece as well. And these are what I would call articulation pitfalls, right? So an articulation pitfall happens when we've been playing a specific type of articulation for a while, and then all of a sudden the composer changes it, right? And oftentimes what will happen is that we will continue to play the same articulations that we had before and not notice in the music that there are changes. So I thought I would highlight a few of the articulation pitfalls in this piece to look out for, right? So for instance, if we look at measure 4, make sure that you articulate the F sharp that's found in beat 2. That's an articulated note, and it may catch you by surprise. In measure 8, make sure to articulate the A flat C, A flat G, F sharp 16th note passage, which comes from out of beat 3 into the majority of beat 4. Those notes are all tongued, whereas before you have duple slurs. So be careful not to slur any of the notes that are tongued in measure 8, right? Measure 9, make sure to articulate the G and the A where it's written. If you notice that throat G in beat 1, that throat A in beat 2, those are articulated. Measure 14, make sure to articulate the F sharp at the end of the measure. Yeah, if you notice that's actually F sharp is actually articulated within the ritornando that you're starting there. Measure 15, make sure to articulate the A in that measure. Don't slur from the D up to the A, back down to the D. Measure 17, where is measure 17? There it is. Make sure to articulate the B, the D, and the F at the end of the measure. Don't slur those notes, yeah? Measure 19, articulate the Ds in measure 19, which is the next to last measure, right? The low Ds are all articulated. Other than that, primarily what you have in this piece is a slur to tongue to articulation, or tongue to slur to, depending on how you're phrasing it for yourself. Yeah. And then now we go back and we talk about how articulation has something to do with character, right? How short you articulate the notes, how long you articulate the notes. This is very important in terms of the character of the piece. So what I tried to do, and I was playing in kind of a boomy acoustic, so this may have come through, it may not have come through, is that I tried to articulate the notes a little bit on the shorter side, right? I felt that the shorter articulations for the 16th notes lends, again, a little bit more of the sprightly character of the music. So you can do that if you wish, or if you wish and you have a different idea about the character of the piece, you can articulate them a little bit longer. But I think in order to have your articulation heard in an audition, it's very good to always go on the shorter side rather than the longer side on the articulated notes. Okay? So that's a bit about articulation and about the measures where you are articulating a bit differently than you are in the other measures of the piece. Okay, so take note of that. Another important articulation and sort of character indication in this piece are the tenuto markings, right? We find tenutos, or dashes, right, in the music in measure 1, measure 3, measure 4, measure 5, measure 6, measure 11, measure 13, measure 15, and I believe measure 16, right? We see these tenuto markings over notes. And what does that mean? Well, that means to articulate these notes without an accent, perhaps with the air rather than with the tongue, and to most especially lean on the notes a little bit, right? When we see a tenuto marking in music, we want to lean on the note. We want to create sort of this idea of sighing into the note. So it's like, and then we release, right? So in the tenuto, you breathe in, and then you breathe out on the next note, right? That's the feel of the note. So a tenuto is an expression marking as well as an articulation marking for us, and we find them all over the piece. So all those measures that I just mentioned, make note of the articulation of the tenuto marking on those notes. It also means, I think, in this piece, going back to the character, as I spoke before, this sprightly character, that you can slightly put a lift. In other words, the note lifts just a little bit, slight lift, before you go on in the music on most of these notes where you have a tenuto. This is a very common thing to do also, and that helps to create a nicer feel of expression in the music, okay? Looking at other articulations in the piece, we find one, I believe only one, accent in the entire piece, and this happens at the very end of the piece, right? On that open G. So this note you can accent a little bit harder, but be careful. This is quite a fatiguing etude to play, and there is a big chance that your embouchure is going to be quite tired by the time you get to that open G, and if so, there is a chance that if you hammer that accent too hard, you're going to squeak on that open G. So be careful. Try not to over-accent that open G when you get to it. Otherwise, you're probably going to get a high D coming out instead of a high G, and that would be unfortunate if everything else you played in the piece was excellent and then you squeaked on that last note. So be careful. If your embouchure is tired, don't accent that last G too much. If you feel confident that your embouchure is strong and that everything is going great, go ahead and make a real accent so that the jury, or adjudicators rather, can hear that you understand that there's an accent on that last G. Okay, that's very important. Okay, so the third category of things to talk about this etude is basically everything else, and I guess that's a little bit more than just one category, right? So we have the technical considerations, we have breathing, we have the dynamics, and of course we have the rhythms in the piece, right? So in looking at this piece, there are some pretty tricky technical passages in it. It's not easy. And one thing that comes back over and over and over in this piece is going from the left hand C here over to the right hand E flat D sharp over here. And I'm saying this again to all of you that do not have the alternate E flat D sharp key here. If you have that, you can play it differently. However, for the majority of us that do not have that key, whenever we have a C followed by an E flat or D sharp, we always need to play that C in the left hand, right? I know I come back to that over and over in these videos because this comes back over and over in this music. So, and it's a very, 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 very prevalent in this piece. In fact, the measures where you will use a left-hand C to a right-hand E flat are measure 1, measure 3, 4, 6, 8, 16, and 19. I think I got them all. I might not have gotten them all, but I think I did. So again, measure 1, 3, 4, 6, 8, 16, and 19. You're going from left-hand C to right-hand E flat or D sharp. Why do we do this? Because on the French system clarinet, we cannot move between C and E flat over here in the right hand and have the connection be smooth, right? So that's one technical consideration. Another one is that you have in measure 13, I believe it is here, yes, you have the B double flat, right? B double flat, otherwise known as A natural, right? So if looking at that B double flat is troublesome, go ahead and just write A natural over it. That's what I did, right? So that reminds you that the B double flat is an A natural. Another technical consideration happens in measure 15, which is the high D, right? In this measure, you're slowing down, and you are also asked to do a diminuendo into the high D, right? So one thing that can help that high D to speak is to finger the D with the fingering called a half hole, right? So what does that mean? Normally we play high D like this, right, on the clarinet. We uncover this first tone hole in the left index finger, right? That creates all sorts of issues for us, which I don't have time to go into now. But if you'd like to have a lesson sometime, you can contact me and we can talk about why notes above high C are difficult on the French system B-flat clarinet. It has everything to do with uncovering this hole. But anyway, I digress there. What I'm trying to talk about is a half hole fingering for high D. So here's our traditional high D. In order to make that high D come out smooth, what we can do is we can cover half of, let's see if I can point to this, of the first left index finger tone hole. In other words, instead of leaving it completely open, we are going to uncover half of it, right? And you can all experiment with exactly how much of that tone hole to uncover in order to create a nice connection. Well, it's not slurred actually, but in order to rather have the high D speak quite nicely, right? Oftentimes doing this, venting the clarinet here, is very difficult to articulate a high D, especially at a softer dynamic. So half-holing this high D, uncovering half of this high D, will allow that note to speak much, much, much easier. And in other pieces where, for instance, you have a slur from an F to a high D, an E to a high D, you can execute that slur much easier by simply half-holing that first index finger, first tone hole on the left-hand joint, okay? So that will help you really get a super soft D that the jury here will be incredibly happy to hear, and not have the D delay in speaking or possibly squeak. So remember, half-holing the high D in measure 15 is a good thing to do, okay? Now we talk a little bit about the breathing. Most of the breathing here is somewhat straightforward. There's one place in the piece where I don't quite agree with the breath mark, and we'll get to that. But in general, the places you want to breathe are in measure 3 after the D, the dotted D quarter note, measure 5 where it's indicated, which is after the D on beat 3. I think the breath should actually be before the D, but that's a long story. I won't go into that now. Basically what's happening in the music there is that you're repeating what happened at the beginning. So there should not really be a break between the 8th note D and the 2/16th note Ds at the end of measure 5. However, it's written in the music, and because this is an audition, you should take a breath there, okay? So a little breath there. You can take a breath after measure 6 if you'd like, then re-articulate the C on the downbeat of measure 7. Let's see. You can breathe after the dotted G flat in measure 10. That's kind of your next breath. So the breath that you take at the end of measure 6, if you can push all the way to the end of measure 10, will be very, very good. You take that breath after the dotted G flat in measure 10. The next breath would be after our notorious low E flat, which you're going to play an octave higher, which we find in measure 12. And then you're going to breathe after the A flat quarter on beat 1 of measure 13. And then, of course, after the high D In measure 15 that we just talked about with the half hole, you can breathe there. Perhaps take a little millisecond of time or so before you go on to beat 4 in measure 15. I think that's a nice thing to do. Let the D clear the air and then go on to that beat, 4 in measure 15. And then, okay, so this is a little bit tricky breath, the next one I'm going to talk about. You will probably want to breathe at the end of measure 16 after the dotted quarter note C. However, if you do that, you will not be able to do the crescendo that's written there, because in order to execute that crescendo, you need to play through the C at the end of 16 into the downbeat of 17. So if you take the breath at the end of 16, you will have to avoid doing the crescendo. It just won't work, right? And that's basically your last breath, or perhaps not last breath, if you take the breath back in measure 15 as your last breath, until you reach the end of the piece, which is also a long haul, but there's really nowhere else to breathe after that. So that's a little bit tricky, but you know, build up your strength and you'll be able to get that far without breathing. Okay? Okay, so that's about breathing. Now we look at dynamics. The dynamics in this piece are pretty easy to follow. Again, there are a lot of mezzo dynamics. We have mezzo forte, we have mezzo piano. These are dynamics that are very hard to hear in an audition. It's very hard to differentiate between mezzo forte, forte, mezzo piano, piano when you're playing in a classroom, perhaps with your adjudicators behind a screen. So my suggestion is that perhaps with mezzo fortes, you need to think about upping that dynamic a little bit, especially if it's followed by a soft dynamic. Mezzo piano, you want to perhaps lower the volume of your mezzo pianos, especially if it's followed by fortes. That way you can actually hear a difference in the dynamics. Hearing mezzo type dynamics, mezzo forte, mezzo piano on the clarinet is difficult, especially in certain acoustics. So I suggest rethinking mezzo forte and mezzo piano in this piece so that it works out well, or is audible. There are a few dynamic oddities in this piece. One of them is found in measure 4 through measure 5. Measure 4 we have a forte written, we have nothing after that, and then in measure 5 we have a crescendo to a mezzo piano. So if you've already been at forte, how can you crescendo to a mezzo piano? Well, you cannot really, right? Unless it's a mezzo piano subito, which doesn't really make sense. So I have a feeling, and I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, that's fine, you can feel free to disagree with me, but I think there's a missing diminuendo in measure 4. So I put that in the performance I did. So in other words, I played forte through the first 2-3 beats of measure 4, then I did a diminuendo, and then I came back up a little bit more in measure 5. That seems to make more sense to me, rather than playing forte and then crescendoing perhaps to a subito mezzo piano on the and of 2 in measure 5 and the downbeat of measure 3. So that's quite odd what's written there. So if you want to rethink it the way I did, I don't think anybody's going to hold that against you. There's another strange one. Well, if we look at measure 7, there appears to be a random diminuendo or perhaps accent written there. I would ignore that. I have a feeling that that's a printing error or perhaps a, what do you call it, software notation error. I don't think that's supposed to be an accent or diminuendo, so just cross that out in measure 7. It doesn't make sense that it's there. And then if we look at the end of the piece, from about measure 14, or rather 16, 15, 16 on to the end of the piece, you have a lot of random crescendoing and diminuendoing without any real guideline as to what dynamic you're crescendoing from or to. So I leave it to you to decide what to do. I don't think that your adjudicators are going to hold it against you if you decide to, you know, perhaps drop down in a different place, crescendo in a different place, this type of thing. What's written there is rather ambiguous in regard to the dynamic. So one thing you may wish to do is discuss this if you have a private teacher. Discuss with him, you know, what dynamic should I crescendo to? Should I then do a diminuendo? These crescendos, diminuendos from 15 onward to the end of the piece seem to be rather random. So hopefully your teacher can give you a guide, or your band director can give you a guide as to exactly how to execute those. Again, they're in the music, you're doing an audition, So you have no choice but to actually follow them, even though they may seem a bit random. Okay, so let's just talk about one other thing in the piece, actually, and that is rhythmic pitfalls. We talked a little bit earlier about articulation pitfalls, how change in articulation can all of a sudden catch us off guard. In this piece, there are really no rhythmic pitfalls until we get to the very end of the piece. What you want to make sure to do is to take that last throat G, which we find at the end of measure 19, and make sure that you hold that the correct amount of beats into beat 20. Your tendency, or my tendency when I was learning the piece this morning, was to hold that too short. So be careful, make sure it's 1, 2, 3, and then the downbeat, right? So you have da 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 downbeat, right? Again, your tendency is going to be to play that G too short when you get to the end, okay? Good, so I know that I probably have not covered everything in the piece here that I possibly could, but I hope that what I have told you is helpful. If you continue on in the video at this point, you will see the notes that I made to help me talk to you about the piece, so you can go back and refer to them if you wish. And as a surprise this year, I've included a performance by some of my students here at Shenandoah Conservatory. We performed a piece called The Shaman Speaks for clarinet choir by a great composer named Vivian Fung last April. And I never uploaded it, so I thought, it would be a really nice thing to upload it at the end of this video so you can watch it. It's a really cool piece, very dissonant, as you will see. So I hope you'll enjoy that. And I wish good luck to all of you on your audition, and I hope it goes absolutely fantastically for you. Take care, and I'll see you soon.